Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. This is John. I am the event coordinator here at Murder by the Book in Houston. And before I get us into tonight's event, while we're waiting for everybody to get the notification that we've gone live, figured I will let you guys know a little bit about what is going on with us at the bookstore today. We cannot thank everybody enough for the support. We had one of our busiest sales days in a while, so it was really great to see everybody come out. At 1 o'clock, we did a Murder by the Book Recommends event. If you were not in store and you missed that and you want to catch it, it is up on the store's Facebook and YouTube channel. It was the first time that we have tried to do an in-store event that we live streamed at the same time. So I think it went really well. So hopefully we're going to be doing some more of that. If you are local and you're wondering about in-store events, we started them back up again in January. So when you're looking at the store's event calendar, we've got everything listed as either a virtual event or an in-store event. We're going to keep doing both for a while, but we are telling everybody if there's an author that's coming through in person that you want to see, please come see them. We're kind of starting over from scratch with doing in-store events again. So we want to let publishers know that there is a desire to do both. So if somebody's coming through, come see them. So that way we can tell people that you guys are still coming out for author events. Speaking of, our next one is going to be on Saturday, May 14th. Claudia Gray has a new book out called The Murder of Mr. Wickham. If you guys are Jane Austen fans, it's a really wonderful Jane Austen murder mystery. Basically, Emma is having a big summer house party. She's invited all of Jane Austen's characters. Mr. Wickham shows up uninvited, causes a bunch of trouble, and drops dead. And so then Jonathan, Darcy, and another young woman team up to figure out what's happening and solve the mystery. It's really wonderful. So Claudia Gray is going to be at the store on Saturday the 14th at 3 o'clock. So I hope you guys will check that out. If you're not local and you want signed copies, you can always order those online, and I've dropped a link for that event in the comments. Tonight, while I am chatting with Amanda, Anna, and Victoria, if you have questions for them, please post those in the comments on Facebook or the live chat on YouTube, and we will get to them as we're talking. We also have signed book plates to go with all three of their new books. So if you want signed book plates to go with your books, I'm also dropping a link in the comments where you can order copies of their new ones or their previous books as well. So I'm going to get us started tonight and bring our authors on. I am going to start with Victoria Thompson. How are you tonight, Vicki?
I'm great. Thank you, John. Happy to be here.
Thanks so much for joining us. So Victoria's newest book is Murder on Madison Square. She is the Edgar and Agatha Award-nominated author of the Gaslight Mysteries, the Counterfeit Lady Mysteries, and numerous historical novels, and she lives in the Chicago area with her family. Next up, I'm going to bring out Annalee Huber. How are you tonight, Anna?
Hi, I'm doing great. Thanks for having us. Yeah, it's good to see you.
So as I think I've mentioned every time we've chatted with, I think Anna is happy for us, one of the authors that we've gotten to chat with most through having two books out the last couple of years, a year, and the anthology and interviewing other authors. So it's always great to get to see. I think it's like every 3 months or something we get to check in, which is really fun.
I love it. Yeah.
So Anna's newest release is A Perilous Perspective, which is the newest in the Lady Darby Mysteries. Annalee Huber is the Daphne Award-winning author of the national best-selling Lady Darby Mysteries and the Verity Kent Mysteries. She's a summa cum laude graduate of Lipscomb University in Nashville, Tennessee, where she majored in music and minored in psychology. And she currently resides with her family and is hard at work on her next novel. And last but definitely not least, we're going to bring out Amanda Quick, Jayne Ann Krentz. How are you tonight, Jayne?
Great, thank you. Excited to be here.
It's good to see you again. So Jayne's newest release is When She Dreams, which is the newest book in the Burning Cove series. And so Amanda Quick is a pseudonym for Jayne Ann Krentz, the author of more than 50 New York Times bestsellers. She writes historical romance novels under the Quick name, contemporary romantic suspense under the Krentz name, and futuristic romance novels under the pseudonym Jayne Castle. There are more than 35 million copies of her books in print, that's just astounding.
Don't remind me. I try to ignore the numbers now. I've been doing this a while.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, if you guys have questions.
I feel like a slacker compared to
You've been doing it as long as I have, Vicki. No, you don't.
But I don't have as many books to show for it.
But we've been in the trenches the same amount of time, and it's the new one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and for a new author, I mean, Anna, you've got a ton of books too. I mean, between the three of you guys, it's a lot of books for people to read.
We'll keep you busy a while.
Yeah, definitely. So as I mentioned, if you guys have questions for any of them about these new books that we're talking about, upcoming projects, previous stuff, please post those and we'll get to them. But we're going to start off super easy. Vicki, we'll start with you. Can you tell everybody a little bit about just kind of your series in general, and then a little bit about the new book?
Well, the Gaslight Mystery series is 25 books long with this book, Murder on Madison Square. And it starts out, Sarah is a midwife and Frank Malloy is a police detective. And they are sort of in the beginning accidentally paired up to solve a murder mystery. And it sort of blossoms from there. It takes them 15 books to finally get together, but they are now married by book 25 and still solving mysteries left and right. And in this book, they get kind of involved with these people because they go to the first ever auto show ever held in America. It was held in New York City in 1900, and Frank was very interested in automobiles because he's just purchased one of the very early models of an automobile. And so he takes Sarah and his partner Gino and his assistant Maeve all to the auto show, and there they run into this guy that eventually ends up murdered, and so they start to solve his case. But I found a lot of interesting stuff about the early automobile industry that I threw in the book too. It was fun.
Yeah, well, and I'll ask a little bit more questions about that in a little bit. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting that we'll get into too is just how much like the historical stuff about the auto industry is like so similar to like what's going on today in the auto industry. I thought that was really, really interesting. All right, next up, Anna, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Lady Darby series and what we're up to in the new one?
Sure, yeah. So the Lady Darby series is set in 1830s Scotland, Britain. And Lady Darby is a portrait artist. She has knowledge of anatomy from her first husband, which I won't go all into that. And she now teams up with her husband, who's a gentleman inquiry agent. And in the latest book, they are headed back to the Highlands. We haven't been back to the Highlands since book one. They're going to Argyll, which is along the western coast near the Hebrides. It's beautiful there, very rural. And so they're going to basically a house party for her friend Charlotte and her cousin Rye's wedding. And the owner of the manor has an extensive art collection, which of course Kira is just ecstatic about because she's the portrait artist. She loves art. And she's examining his collection and she uncovers a forgery. And the owner is not very happy about that. And then a maid is found dead beneath the forged painting. And so then they are on the case, figuring out how these forgeries happened, how did they get fooled, and why the maid was killed.
Perfect. And then Jayne, you want to tell us a little bit about your little town and the newest release?
Burning Cove. This is the sixth book into the Burning Cove series. Time flies. And this is 1930s California, but I want to emphasize this is the mythic California. This is the glamour of the 1930s image of California that I ran with. I think as a historical, when you incorporate history, you've got the choice to make. How you go for the gritty dark side, or do you go for the mythic light side? I'm pulling on the mythic light side. And the town is basically a wealthy little enclave where the Hollywood glamour crowd and mobsters and nightclubs and that kind of thing. It's a playground for the wealthy and the glamorous. And people keep dropping dead. So, well, so in the other element I'm always playing with in these books now is the psychic vibe. I love to work with the psychic vibe. And in this case, it's set around a murder that occurs at a lucid dreaming conference. Lucid dreaming was a big thing in the 30s. And it is today, too.
Awesome. Okay, so since we kind of themed the thing, obviously you guys all write historical mysteries. So the one thing I wanted to know was, when you set out to start your series, did you know that you were going to do a historical? Did you know, like, what came first, the mystery aspect of it or the historical aspect of it? How about you, Vicki?
Well, my story is kind of unusual if you haven't heard it before. I was writing historical romances in my early career, and then and then the bottom sort of fell out of the historical romance market, and I was writing westerns, and they were no longer popular. The cowboy went out of fashion, and so my publisher said they weren't going to buy any more books for me, and I was like sort of at loose ends trying to decide what I was going to write next. And I really, really wanted to write a romantic suspense, woman in jeopardy kind of book. And I was trying to write, I was sending them left and right to my agent. My agent was like getting glowing rejections from it. And she kept saying, why don't you write a mystery series? And I'm like, and I said the 13 stupidest words I've ever said, which were, ew, I don't want to be stuck writing the same characters over and over again. So now, of course, my series is 25 books long. To eat those words. But so I kept resisting and resisting for about a year. And then one day she called me up and said, my agent called me up and said, I just had lunch with an editor from Berkeley. They're looking for somebody to write a mystery series set in turn of the century New York City where the heroine is a midwife. Would you be interested? And I said, well, let me think. My daughter had just started school at NYU, and we had walked around Greenwich Village. We'd even stopped in a bookstore and bought some books on the history of Greenwich Village just because for fun. So I'd already started doing research, and I was at that time working for the March of Dimes, and some of my volunteers were actually midwives. And I thought, it's kismet. I was born to write this series. But I will tell you a little secret. The secret is, if they had said, we'd like you to write a series set in medieval Mesopotamia where the heroine is a potter, I would have said, it's kismet. Write this series. So that's how the series was born. They said they wanted the heroine to be a midwife and set in turn of the century New York City. And from then I could just do whatever I wanted. So I created Frank Malloy because I knew a midwife was probably not in the normal course of her life going to be encountering a lot of murdered people. So hopefully not anyway. And Frank's job was to solve murders. So I thought I'd pair the two of them up. And so that's how it came. So it's an unusual story, but very fortunate that it happened.
How about you, Anna?
So I guess I kind of always wanted to write historical. The first Lady Darby book was my first published book. I wrote 4 other books before that. They were all historical set. That's really the only thing that connects them. So yeah, I guess it was the history that came first, but I wanted to do mystery too. I mean, it was really hand in hand, and I wanted that romance element. And really for me, the character came first. Kira just started talking to me in my head, and she wouldn't go away. I was trying to work on something else. And so I was like, okay. So I sat down, I wrote the first chapter, and then I was just sold. Then I had to stop and figure out, okay, who is this woman talking to me, and figure out her backstory and all that. But yeah, from the very beginning, it was pretty much just her talking to me, but it was always definitely historical set. And there was some and the murder happens right at the beginning. So of course it was going to be a mystery. So yeah.
And how about you, Jayne? Since you bounce back and forth between past, present, and future, how do you decide where you're going to set something?
Well, I got into the historical thing sort of by reverse action, I guess you would say. From the very beginning of my career, what I really wanted to write more than anything else was romantic suspense, and I wanted to set it in the future. I wanted a futuristic setting. There was no market for it. I wound up doing contemporaries, which I love too. So that worked out well. And then I decided the market had changed. It was time for me to introduce the world to futuristic romantic suspense. And the world didn't want futuristic romantic suspense. And the problem was I did it under my Krentz name. And in the process, I killed it off. it was a real case of career suicide, because once those 3 books had gone out into the world and failed, nobody wanted a Krentz book. You know how we all know how this market can work. So I had to reinvent myself at that point. And that's when I stepped back and I looked at my core story. And my core story is romantic suspense with issues of trust and issues of 2 people having to work together who don't really have anything in common and don't think they like each other very much, but they got to work together to survive. And I thought, oh, well, there's a place for that. And it's in the historical market. Marriage of convenience is what it would be in the historical market. So that's how Amanda Quick came to be. And now I love it.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about research. So we'll start with Anna. So, what kind of research did you do, not only into art, because, we mentioned in your bio that you have like a background in music. So what made you decide to make her an artist, and what kind of research? And then also, I thought it was really interesting how you also touch on like forensics and blood splatter in this book. Can you talk a little bit about the research into all of that?
Yeah, sure. So I always think of, I'm a musician, but really all artists kind of have this same kind of creative mindset, the way we look and think about things. And so I felt like even if she wasn't a musician, my heroine, I could still relate to her. And I thought, how perfect to make her a portrait artist, because they're, what they do is look. I mean, they see what other people don't see, and that's how they capture it. You know what I mean? Like, and so she could really bring those skills to bear, especially, with her anatomy illustration that she has history of. So that's kind of really how I decided to make her an artist, just the mindset and the fact that it would be useful as an investigator. And, for this book, like I got to do all that art forgery research, which was, oh my goodness, it was so much fun to research. The trick was figuring out what she could have figured out. I mean, like nowadays we can use x-rays and all these things, chemicals and all these things to figure out whether it's a legit painting or not. And it was like, well, what could she have known? What skills could she have brought to bear? And the same thing with the forensics, what would she have learned from her anatomist husband, or late her anatomist husband, about these kind of things? What do they play into with her art and all of that? So a lot of it, sometimes it doesn't spell it out in the research. It's one of those things where you have to just do your diligence and then be like, well, logically, they could work this out. You know what I mean? Because there's not necessarily a book that says, well, in 1832, they knew this, this, and this, So, so a lot of it is that just connecting the dots.
Perfect. And how about you, Vicki? Can you tell us a little bit about like the research and like what made you specifically, like you said, this one was set kind of during one of the first car shows. Can you talk a little bit about the research into that, and a little bit about like the electric cars, which was crazy to me that they were basically making hybrids back then, and that like they're not a thing now, or they are a thing, but they're not like the main thing now.
Right. Yeah. When I start a new book, I usually know about the time period, what year it's going to be, what month in that year. So I start reading what's behind me here is my research library, and I pull out some books and I start reading what was going on at that time in the real world, see if there's something, little hook that I can hang the book on. And I came across the information that the first auto show was held in November of 1900 in Madison Square Garden, and I thought, oh, wouldn't that be fun? Because Frank would want to go because he has a car and he wanted to know about all the cars. And I had already learned a little bit about cars, about the early automobile industry, and I learned a lot more. As Jayne and Anna will tell you, I bored them silly with all of my exciting facts as I was learning them. But at that time there were about 8,000 cars in the United States total. 4,000 of them were in New York City. So that's why they had the first auto show there. And there were 200 companies building them. So do the math. That's not a big output on those, because they were doing it by hand. They didn't have the assembly lines yet. Henry Ford was not making cars yet. And all those 200 companies, none of them are alive today. So there was a lot of flux in that era. But the most interesting thing is there were 3 ways that automobiles were propelled: gasoline, was one, steam was one, and electricity was one. Now, steam didn't make it because it took about 30 minutes at least, 45 if it was cold out, to get a head of steam up to get your car going. So there was no fast getaways in steam. And, so that didn't last long. But the electric was, and the gasoline was noisy and produced noxious fumes that were poisonous. And it was very dangerous to start. You had to crank it. And if the car backfired while you were cranking it, it could break your thumb. It would reverse the crank. It could break your thumb if you were lucky. If you were not lucky, it might break your arm, or it might fly off and hit you in the head and kill you. So
Oh gosh.
it was very dangerous to drive these cars. Plus you had to shift gears, which was also took some strength to do. So all these things were against the gasoline powered car. The electric car was quiet, no noxious fumes, easy to start. You just got in and pushed the pedal and there off you went. It was great. The problem was they couldn't come up with a battery. The batteries were really big and clunky and heavy, and they only lasted for about 25 miles. So that was fine if you're driving around New York City, but if you wanted to go on a trip, forget it. You were stuck. And most homes in 1900, even most homes were not wired for electricity. So charging it was a little problematic. And even Thomas Edison tried to develop a longer lasting battery at that time, but even he couldn't come up with something that would work. And carrying a spare wasn't even an option because they were so big and heavy. So gasoline sort of by default became the method of choice. But we could have had, electric cars from the very beginning if we just think how different our world would be.
Yeah.
If that had happened.
Yeah, it was trippy reading it, as that you mentioned they were talking about like being able to like set up charging stations in New York and like that time period. And it's just kind of mind boggling that was like the technology was there then.
Right. If you see a picture of the charging stations, then they look remarkably like the charging stations now. I mean, it's a simple concept.
And how about you, Jayne, for your books? Because you mentioned that with this one, that it's that lucid dreaming is a big part of it, and it was a big part in the 30s. So what sort of research did you do kind of about what a small Hollywood town like that would be like? And then also like the mechanics of lucid dreaming and stuff like that.
Well, the lucid dreaming thing is just a hot topic even now. If you go online, people are selling programs for supposedly teaching you how to do the lucid dreaming thing. And for those who aren't familiar with that term, it's that sensation of knowing you're in the dream when you are dreaming, that you're aware of the dream. And the goal of controlling lucid dreaming for most people is to be able to re-script the dream, to take control of the script. And it can be very helpful if you could master it, I guess, for dealing with nightmares or bad recurring dreams, things that plague a lot of people. So it has a practical purpose too. But for the most part, it did not work out as a scientific approach to treating depression and neurosis and shattered nerves, which were the main complaints of the time. And that's why people like Freud and Jung were looking at it as a method of treating for psychological problems. But the other side of that, so it had a very strong scientific, strong research bent. But the other side, the flip side, was a lot of scam artists saw a lot of ways to make money. And they sort of segued lucid dreaming into astral travel. If you could lucid dream well enough, you could travel in your dreams. And I just love that kind of stuff. And the great thing about dealing with dreams in the books is that there's no really good scientific research that you have to worry about. And we still don't know how it works. So I'm free to play with it. And that's so for me. And the thing about the whole psychic vibe is that I don't have to worry about forensics. I don't have to solve the crime with forensics. So it just leaves me free to play.
And I like with these that you attend, with the like Arcane Society and some of the other stuff, like you kind of get more into kind of like the more like paranormal. I like that you kind of approach kind of it from the psychic perspective for these. So kind of depending on how you're reading it, like maybe you think that this is happening, maybe that's just like a con artist thing. I really like that balance that you pull off with these too.
Yeah, I when I try to explain what I'm doing to people who aren't kind of outside the genre, I make it clear that I'm doing the psychic vibe. I'm not doing the supernatural vibe with vampires and werewolves and witches. And I think the psychic vibe works for a lot of people because it's just literally one step beyond intuition. Everybody grasps the concept.
Yeah. So another thing I wanted to talk about is, so as we mentioned during the bios, you guys all do multiple books a year. How do you do multiple books a year? Let's start with Anna. Can you talk a little bit about what that process is?
Yeah. So, well, you're never working on just one thing at a time. Let's put it that way. I mean, for me, I'm always writing one draft at a time, like the first initial draft, that discovery draft. But yeah, it's a lot of, I don't know, just juggling and organizing. I mean, for me, I'll be writing, it takes me about 4 to 6 months to write a book. So I'll be, writing one while copy editor on another and proofreads and promos on another. I always just say it's like any job. You just have to figure out, get organized enough and get motivated. And it actually keeps me from procrastinating. If I'm not writing a lot, like I tend to procrastinate, and it actually takes me longer to write a book than it does when I'm busier. It's a contradiction, but yeah.
How about you, Vicki?
Well, I only write 2 books a year, so it's not quite as bad, but I'm a pretty fast writer. But I usually take a couple months to research and figure out what the book's about. And by that point, then I know I have a pretty good idea what the story is. And then I don't usually admit this in mixed company, but I'm a one draft writer. So I write what I write is pretty much it, and do a final edit. But I don't rarely make any major changes. At what I write, and so it's easy for me to set a schedule, say 1 chapter a week, and, 15 weeks I'm done. So that's how I do it. And I take 6 months. I'd like to say I take 6 months to write a book, but I really take about 4 months to write a book. And then I take the summer off, and I take some time off at Christmas time. So to sort of refill the well, one thing I learned is you don't take a little time off in between books, you sometimes burn out. So
yeah.
I like
and how about you, Jayne? Because don't you have like a book from each pseudonym out this year?
I do this year, but I'm mostly a 2 book a year writer. But the 3rd book gets in if there's time in my schedule. And like Vicki, I'm probably about 4 months per book is my normal schedule. And even when I don't have to do that many books a year, if I don't want to, that it's not going to take me any more time to write a book. I write a book. We've all got, I think every writer has a natural pace, and my pace is my pace. And I think if I tried to change it, I'd lose the momentum. I think I'd either grow bored with the book because I was taking too much time, or it would get sloppy if I tried to make it faster. This is what I need to write the books.
Yeah. So I also wanted to talk about both Vicki and Anna. You guys, your characters have children in these books. So can you talk about, let's start with Vicki. Can you talk about how you, like once you've paired up your main characters and they have kids, how do you balance making sure that like the kids are kind of there, but at the same time getting them out of the way so your characters can solve the crimes?
When I realized I was going to write a mystery, finally, I contacted Janice Young Brooks, who wrote mysteries as Jill Churchill, and I said, she was a good friend of mine, and I said, what do you wish you had known before you started writing your series? And she told me a couple tips to watch out for, and one of them was, don't give your heroine children that need a babysitter. So, so of course that was the first thing I did was I gave Frank a son, but I gave him his mother also. The mother takes care of his son, so Frank doesn't have to he doesn't have to worry about childcare. He has that covered. And Sarah was a widow with no children at first, so no problem. But it quickly became apparent to me that she needed a child, and she wasn't going to be marrying Frank anytime soon. So how is she going to get a child? So she adopts, takes in a child. She can't legally adopt because she's a single woman back in that period of time. But she gets a child, but she can't stay home all day taking care of a child. She has mysteries to solve. So she also hired a girl to take care of the child, a nanny. So she has a live-in nanny who takes care of the child. Unfortunately, now the live-in nanny has started helping solve the mystery. So now that they're married, Frank's mother lives with them. So they have Maeve to be the part-time nanny, and they have the mother as a backup. They even have a neighbor across the street who can pitch in if necessary. But I highly recommend, do not give your characters a child that needs a babysitter. It's always like, are they in school? What day is it? What month is it? Is school out? It's, I'm always trying to figure out the schedule and where are the kids coming up from school or what's going on. So yeah, it's hard.
And how about you, Anna? Because Lady Darby has like a baby, so you're trying to figure out like feedings in the middle of all of this too.
Yes. Yeah. So really, with the series, I mean, they marry in book 4, the end of book 4, and so it was like kind of a natural progression. Well, they got to have a kid eventually, So it's just like, okay, well, it's time. And it was tricky this first book because she's 3.5 months old. So yeah, like. She can't just disappear. You can't just send her off. And, because I was like, I'm not going to make her a mother where she sends the child off with the nursemaid for 2 years and hardly sees them, So, and in this period, women, even upper class, they were taking care of the children. They weren't sending them off like that all the time. But it does help that they're upper class. So they have a nanny. I think it's funny too, because all of my servants end up getting in on the mystery solving too. And even the nanny in this one gets roped in. She helps out. So they're kind of a whole crew by this point. But yeah, it definitely helps to have the nanny, to have the lady's maid if you need, or the aunts, whoever's around to help with the child. But yeah, I found the trickiest thing being she's there. I can't ignore she's there. I have to like mention her once in a while. But the main focus of the story is solving the mystery, not taking care of the child. So
yeah, I'll tell you something funny because all my fans want Sarah and Frank, now that they're married, to have a baby. And I'm like, she can't have a baby. She wouldn't have time to solve the mystery, so she had a baby. And so I was discussing it with my editor. I said, what do you think? Do you think they need to have a baby? She says, and I explained to her, what the problem is. And she said, well, why don't you ask Anna? She's got a baby. See if she's going to handle it. So, but you notice, Anna, I did not ask you because I just decided not to go there.
And so for Jayne, for you, since your series is structured more in a traditional kind of romance structure where by the time the characters are like thinking of having babies, we've moved on to another couple. Is that something that you've thought about or worried about?
The joys of not having a continuing character. I do like us. I always start over with a fresh set of characters at the start of each novel, even though the town, in this case, Burning Cove, is the backdrop, and there will be returning characters from previous books in the background. I always like to start with a fresh couple to do the crime solving. And I think that's partly to avoid that problem. But also, at some earlier point in my career, I actually tried a couple of times to do a continuing series, and they just didn't work. There was, what was it? Lydia something, Lake and March. There was a Regency series that I tried. She was kind of a hypnotist, and he solved crimes, and I got 3 books into that, and it bombed. Couple of times I've tried to go forward with a continuing series, and whatever the magic is that Victoria and Anna have, I didn't have, so I play it safe now.
So Victoria, since both of your series, both this one and the Counterfeit Lady series, take place kind of in New York roughly the same time, when you're figuring out, because so basically there's a lot of kind of the same stuff going on kind of in the world, how do you figure out which of your characters is going to get the plot? And like, has there been any crossover between the two series?
Well, there hasn't been any crossover because there's about 20 years difference in them. I might have a retired Frank Malloy show up in one of my Counterfeit Lady series one day, but, or their children maybe show up, but because they do have, Frank has a son and Sarah has the adopted daughter, but what was the question?
How do you decide, since they're kind of...
How do I decide?
Yeah.
So it's pretty easy. The fact that they're 20 years apart, it's the world was actually very different, because in the Counterfeit Lady series, which takes place it starts right about the time America enters World War I, and very quickly then the war is over, and so they're entering the 1920s and dealing with prohibition and dealing with all the roaring 20s and the crime and all the things that were going on in the world then, and the flu epidemic and all those kinds of things. That none of that existed in 1900 when the other series is set at the moment. So the main thing I have to be careful with in the two series is technology. Is what did they have? Because in 20 years, a lot of things develop, as we've seen in our own lifetimes. So did they have this? Did they have that? Everybody has a phone by 1920. And they probably have electricity, which wasn't necessarily true in 1900. So you have to be careful about making it historically accurate. I always try to keep it as accurate as possible. So those are the things I have to worry about. But I don't think we're going to have any crossover in the foreseeable future.
Yeah. And so for you, Anna, one of the things that's really great about the books is like your characters have like their Scottish accent. So how do you write that, and how do you decide how much of that to put in and how much to not put in, and potentially have to like define words for people if they're not familiar with it?
Right. So I will say a lot of my influence comes from reading other authors who write Scottish accents, in particular like Diana Gabaldon. I mean, I don't even do as much as she does. I try to give it the touch that what they're saying and that it's this accent, but that you won't be confused. You don't have to reread the sentence multiple times to figure out what it's saying, because that just bogs it down and people get frustrated. So for me, it's kind of that. It's just going off of other people's examples. I have one book where I have some Irish accents, and that was tricky figuring out because I'm not as used to that one. Like Scottish now is kind of second nature. So, and then like in the Lady Darby book 11, which I'm writing right now, it's in Yorkshire, and so I'm trying to figure out, how much of the Yorkshire dialect to try to portray and how much not to, so it's always a balance.
And one of the things I also thought was interesting about this Lady Darby too is that you mentioned, you like a lot of her servants get in on the action trying to solve the mystery, but at the same time, she's also helping counsel Charlotte on some potential friction with one of her servants. So how do you write something like that friction while still potentially making sure that it's not going to like make the character rub people the wrong way or something? Like what's the balance there? Is that something you have to worry about?
Oh yeah, definitely. Those scenes, I do a lot of thinking about them because especially in our 21st century American mindset, you know what I mean? Like it's already a little strange that you're writing about these aristocrats that have these servants. And I mean, Kira in many senses and Gage are very, have more of a modern tinge in the way that they approach their servants. They're, and they talk about that all the time, that they're not the typical, they're not typical of their class in the way they interact with their servants, but it works for the story. It works for the series. But yeah, when I was having her counsel Charlotte, it was really that governess that's rubbing Charlotte and doing things she shouldn't. It was tricky figuring out how to go about that and how to make the governess, how I needed to make her, but not make it too excessive. And yeah, so definitely, I hope it worked. So
yeah, no, I thought it was a good balance, but as I was reading it, I was curious how that would work, because it would be, I feel like it would probably be really easy to like accidentally make your character unlikable based on like how they would potentially react to stuff.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
And so, Jayne, as I mentioned before we went live, I just recently read through the Fog Lake trilogy, which kind of ties into the Arcane Society books as well. And so, do all of your books take place in this like Jayne verse? Like, are they all sort of in the same world?
Yeah, I didn't see that coming, but at some point it just happened, and the whole concept of the Jayne verse, and Anna's got her verse, and Victoria has her verse. I think every author has their verse, and it was very liberating to just think of it that way and to stop trying to think of every book as having to be totally unique, because authors do spend their whole careers working within their own universe and working with the same themes often for the whole of their careers, and the same kinds of conflicts and emotions that compelled them at the beginning. And I think it's just the best thing you could do is just embrace it and say, this is it. This is my universe.
Yeah. One of the things that I think that doesn't get talked about a lot from a mystery author perspective is, you know, when you talk about like science fiction, fantasy, stuff like that, authors always talk about like world building and stuff like that. But I don't think mystery authors talk about it when you guys are basically doing the same thing, even though it's our world that we live in. I mean, you still have to create your world that has like its own rules, its own social circles, and all of that stuff too. So it's interesting.
Yeah, I speaking out of turn here, but I just have to put in a word for the fact that if you write fiction, you are building a world. That's just how it works.
Yeah, definitely. So Anna, you were the only one who did not get her start or did not start doing romance novels. Victoria mentioned that she did it. Jayne blends them all together so well with elements too. So how do you find when you're writing your mysteries, but there's also this romance between Gage and Kira? How do you find the balance between those elements and your mystery elements?
Sure. And funnily enough, I tried to write historical romance first. I mean, some of my unpublished manuscripts are historical romance. But I kept finding that I had mystery creeping in too much. I had all these dead bodies dropping. And so I was like, well, let me switch this up. Let me make this, let me plot it as a mystery, that they're solving this mystery. And then I can weave the romance in as the subplot. And I loved it. I loved it because I get to have those puzzles that they're solving, but I also get to have that romance and that connection, and that, you know, and that it's a series. I can drag it out longer. I don't have to wrap it up in one book. And I love getting to explore it as married people. I mean, just because you're married doesn't mean the romance is dead. I mean, so it's fun to get to write those scenes where Gage is seducing Kira or whatever, you know what I mean? Because it still happens when you're married. So especially after they've had the child even, you know, so I think for me, it's just it felt natural. I mean, it felt like life to have that. So, yeah.
And how about you, Victoria? How was the transition from doing the romances that you were in the Westerns before to doing mystery?
When they found out that I was making that transition from romance to mystery, everyone told me, my editor, my agent, my friends, they all said, mystery readers don't like romance in their books. So be careful. I'm like, that can't be true. I mean, I'm really thinking that can't be true. So the hardest thing I had to do was when I was writing the very first book in the series, Murder in Astor Place, was Frank and Sarah were so obviously totally different and in every way that they were destined to be together. I mean, in a romance novel, they were the perfect couple. But I couldn't get them together because it was not a romance. So the hardest thing I had to do was to have them have that attraction, but not do anything about it in that first book. And then I started getting fan letters from that first book, and they all said, "Oh, I love the mystery, blah, blah, blah. P.S. When are Frank and Sarah going to get together?" And I thought, mystery readers do like romance.
They do, yeah.
But they do like romance. And they hung around for a long time, bless their hearts. It took me a long time to figure out how to get them together, but I finally managed.
Yeah, I think it was maybe Jen McKinley when I was talking to her about the Cupcake series, that she said that she would get these letters from readers that would be like, I hate the romance, I hate the romance, I hate the romance. Okay, but tell me when the characters are going to get together. So, yeah. And for you, Jayne, so you're basically trying to balance the tropes of two genres. So you've got like kind of the mystery tropes, but then you also, because the romances, you have to have that happily ever after at the end. So but you've been doing it long enough. Like, is it easy for you to balance the two of them together?
Yeah, I think it's just my core story.
Yeah.
I don't have to, it isn't something I consciously think about. It's just that it's part of my core story. I grew up on Nancy Drew. What can I tell you?
So we have a couple questions from the crowd. So Carrie says that she, let me scroll back up. So Carrie says, Victoria, both my mom and I are reading your series. But do you have any other series or any other ideas that are percolating that you might want to tackle at some point?
Well, I have the Counterfeit Lady series. If you're not familiar with it, the heroine is a reformed con artist who gets sucked into the women's suffrage movement by accident and decides to turn her life around and to use her powers for good. So she sets out to help people who the ordinary law can't help. But so she will run a con to assist someone. It's those books have been a lot of fun to write because they're not really mysteries; they're more capers, and and you know I keep thinking that sooner or later the Gaslight Mysteries are going to run out of gas, and I'm going to have to think of a new idea, but that hasn't happened yet. So I'm thinking, but I am thinking all the time, trying to come up with a new idea just in case. And I think I'd like to try maybe a little further along in history, like maybe even World War II as a setting, which everybody seems to be doing right now.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm doing research just for fun, just to see if I can find a hook that interests me that I might try my hand at something new. But for now, the answer is no, nothing's firmed up yet.
And do you have a potential end game for the Gaslight series? Like if you decide at some point, like, okay, I think this is going to be the, like, her, and do you have an idea what that is going to be, or will you just know it when you get there?
I guess I'll know when they say we're not buying any more books. Then I'll know it's time to tie it up. But people say, did you plan out the series? And the answer is absolutely not. I mean, who thinks in the beginning that your series is going to be 25 books long? No one thinks that. I was thrilled that they signed me to a 3-book contract. I thought my series will be 3 books long. Wow, that is so cool. Maybe 6 if I'm really, really lucky. So no, I did not plan anything.
Yeah.
And I had some vague idea that Frank and Sarah would get married in the last book. But then they kept going on, and my fans were like getting mutinous. Like they need to get together. I know they do. So
yeah,
I had to get them together. But yeah, it's so now that they're together, the pressure's off. I can keep on going forever now. But I don't know.
So Chrissy wants to know, and Vicki touched on this about with her original pitch from the editor about what her series was, but so do editors dictate era of the book? So Anna, did you, when you were pitching your first series, was there any conversation about like, oh, we should do this time period or anything, or did you just come say like, this is my time period and I'm running with it?
Yeah, no, I just presented it to as I wanted. I mean, I picked 1830s because nobody was doing it. That was one of the reasons I picked it. Like, there's a lot of Regency, there's a lot of Victorian, but nobody was doing William IV. But there's all this stuff, there's all this wonderful, great history, and it wasn't getting used. And then because of the anatomy aspect, that's the time of the Body Snatchers and the Anatomy Act and all that stuff. So it just fit perfectly. But yeah, no, I just kind of presented it to them. All of my books thus far, that's how it's been, except the new one I have coming up. I'm actually writing a straight historical fiction for the first time.
Ooh.
And this was actually, my editor, Kensington, approached me about it and asked me if I was interested and I would write it for them. And I mean, they basically just said, we want a book where it's set mostly on the Titanic. That was it. And so I was like, okay. And then I came up with the idea because I found these 3 sisters. I found this family that was on the Titanic. They were first-class passengers, and there was 3 sisters in their 20s, and they were all survivors. And I was like, I've never heard of these sisters. Let's look into this. So So basically that's the hook. So this will be the first time that I'm writing historical fiction, straight historical fiction. And it was basically presented, the opportunity was presented from the publisher. So that's the first time that's happened for me.
Awesome. And so when does that come out?
That will be out in early 2024. I've got to write it yet. That's coming up next. So
minor details.
Yeah.
And so how about you, Jayne, you know, with bumping between like the 30s and the Arcane Society and like kind of all over time, are there conversations when you're going to start something new? Or are there conversations about maybe I want to try a different time period, or do you take suggestions, or you just kind of go where you're interested?
Well, probably the clearest cut case is when I decided I wanted out of the 19th century. And I was actually just going to stop being Amanda Quick. And at that point, my editor said, well, let's talk about this. And I said, I just don't have any more stories for the 19th century. It's, you know, I love it, everything. I had a great time there, but I just don't have any more stories. And then we started talking about, well, if you had to go into the 20th century, where would you go? And I'm thinking, not the 50s, not World War II, not World War I. Those are all, I just wasn't interested. But for some reason, during that conversation, I realized that the 30s worked in the same way that the Regency had worked, because it's such a dialogue-driven, there's such a dialogue-driven image of the 30s. People respect the repartee, and that's the stuff. Dialogue's what I love to write. So, but I worried about it for a long time going in, because I've killed off other careers, and I could not find any romantic suspense set in the 30s. And I asked two people, librarians, to help me research this. Lots of mystery, lots of pre-war drama, but straight up romantic suspense really wasn't out there. And I was almost not going to risk it. And then I remembered that we had the movies. And I thought, the movies are familiar, and people will be able to get into this world because they've seen the movies. So that's how I kind of blundered into it.
And are we still going to see more in this series, in the Burning Cove series?
Yeah, kind of like what Vicky said, is they tell you that they're not buying anymore.
Nice.
Kind of how we work.
Yeah. So this is a great question from Jean, not book related, but she says, since it's Teacher Appreciation Week, do any of you have an outstanding teacher or mentor that was important to you that you want to mention? Let's start with Vicky.
You know, I never really liked history in school, except one year when I was a junior in high school. Dr. Sparks was a fabulous teacher, and she told her husband taught at the University of Maryland. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. suburbs, and her husband taught at the University of Maryland. And we asked her why she didn't. She was a PhD at teaching in high school. And we were like, why are you teaching here? And she said, it pays more. And that was her. That was Dr. Sparks. That she made history come alive. And so even though I thought I didn't like history for many, many years, that's what I ended up devoting my career to, was history, and finding all the really neat stuff that happened. So I think she planted that seed.
Nice. How about you, Anna?
So I have two. Ms. Redden was my English teacher in 9th and 10th grade. She was really tough, but she was just an excellent teacher. I mean, I think she first gave me my confidence as an older, you know, not an elementary, but as an older adolescent, that I could write, that I was a good writer, that I should go with my imagination. She was a wonderful teacher. And then I had a AP history teacher, Mr. Goldie, and he showed me, you know, history so much when we learn it at school is just a bunch of facts and dates and things. It's really stale. And he really showed me the narrative of history and the people, that you had to look for the people within the history and the narrative. And that's what history is. And that's what makes it exciting. And so I would say those two were big influences, and I want to give a shout out to.
Awesome. How about you, Jayne?
I think I failed to appreciate my teachers and promptly forgot their names. It's really awful. But I had my comeuppance because I spent 1 year as a school librarian. And 1 year it turned out to prove I suck as a school librarian. And in that 1 year, I saw teachers at work, and I saw the good ones and I saw the not so good ones. And let me tell you, I came away with a huge appreciation for those who have the calling, the ones who got the gift. I couldn't do it in a million years. It is its own thing. You're either blessed with that gift or you're not. I truly think that. And when I saw that in action and realized from observing it, I came away thinking, you know what? You pay them all CEO salaries and you give them anything they want and you get the best. And you will have an investment that you could not beat.
Yeah. All right. So last question for the evening is going to be a two-part question. First part, what's something that you've read lately that you've loved? And the second part is, what do you have coming up next? Let's start with Jayne.
Funny you should ask. I just finished The Hacienda.
It's so good. It's so good.
That's it. That's what I was going to say. You stole my line. This is like the perfect Gothic. And she's not afraid to pull in the horror. And it's Isabel Cañas, and I highly recommend it. And, coming up next, one more Dust Bunny book. I write those under Jayne Castle for those who aren't familiar with the Dust Bunnies. Don't ask. Just don't go there. They've taken over my Jayne Castle world. It's called Sweetwater and the Witch, and it will be out in September.
Perfect. I had a customer that was in yesterday picking up a copy of When She Dreams, and I had mentioned that I was reading through the series and that I have one of the Jayne Castles. And she's like, "Oh, the Dust Bunny books. You'll figure it out. You'll figure it out. I promise." And how about you, Anna? What's something you've read lately that you loved?
Yeah, so I actually was fortunate. I got an early copy of Amanda Flower's first historical mystery because I could not stop for death. It's Emily Dickinson is one of the sleuths, and it's really good. So I'm almost done. So, but it's really good. It comes out later this year. And next for me is the 6th Verity Kent book, A Certain Darkness, and that comes out August 30th.
Nice. And how about you, Vicki?
If you had given me a little heads up, I could have gone back because I can't remember titles. But one book that I've read recently is nonfiction that is called The Woman's Hour. It's about how the 20th Amendment, giving women the right to vote, was passed, and it's the story of the final days of that fight. And it reads like a modern day thriller, even though you know that the act passed the final. It came down to one state, Tennessee. You'd think that 34 states would be easy to get, but they'd gotten 33 states, and 10 had said no, had voted no. And it was down to 2 states, and one, Vermont, had already said their governor wasn't going to present it to the legislature to vote on. So that came down to Tennessee. If Tennessee had not passed it, we wouldn't still have the right to it. Hopefully someday we would have, but the Women's Suffrage Act would not have passed. And it came down to one vote in the Tennessee legislature. It was like, I knew that it passed, and I could not stop reading this book because I could not imagine how it was going to happen. It was so thrilling. It's an amazing book. And I'm hoping to tell that story in the Counterfeit Lady series, which takes place at that time period. And they are involved in the women's suffrage movement. So I'm hoping to do it justice. But what's next for me is the next Counterfeit Lady book is coming out in the fall. Probably in the fall, in December, which is the winter actually. But it's called City of Fortune. And it involves horse racing, which was a lot of fun to research too.
Perfect. So I think that is going to do it for us this evening. So to recap, for anybody who might have tuned in late, we have been chatting with Victoria Thompson, whose newest book, Murder on Madison Square, is out. We've been chatting with Amanda Quick, whose newest release is When She Dreams, and Anna Lee Huber, whose newest book is A Peerless Perspective. If you missed any part of our chat, once we are done, Facebook and YouTube will archive them so you can go back and rewatch. We have been lucky to chat with all three of these authors throughout the last couple of years. So while you were on the Facebook and YouTube channel, you can go back and see our previous chats as well. As I mentioned, we do have signed book plates to go with all three of them. And we actually have signed book plates as Jayne Ann Krentz and Amanda Quick. So if you order any of her Jayne books and you want book plates for those, we have them as well. Jayne and Anna and Victoria, this was so much fun. Thank you for doing this with us tonight.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
It's been great. It's been
You
great.
guys take care and we'll see you soon.
You too.
Bye.